you if you desire to live with more passion, love with more purpose, and lead an overcoming life. Today, we have Chris Krusen, and he is the author, the director of a film that's coming out that really focuses in on mental illness. Well, today on Healing Rain, I have Chris Krusen, and welcome to Healing Rain.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm so glad you're here. And I am thrilled that you are taking on a topic that very few people do. I mean, it's a film where you're talking about Christians and how do we deal with mental illness. And many times it's just a topic that's avoided. We don't talk about our relative that may have schizophrenia. You know, we just tend to be silent. And yet you're tapping into something that is a huge need today. So can you tell me, what is the background to your film, Let Me Have Your Son?
Yes, sure. Well, thank you for having me on your program. The background is, it's sort of hard to say where I should begin when I answer that question. In a sense, I'd say the background begins with my son from the womb. I became a believer at the age of 29, and Daniel, my son, was born when I was 30. And I was one of those people who, when he came to Christ, became quite radical quickly. So he was my firstborn child, and I just kind of claimed all the promises that I read about in the Bible, that he would be a mighty man of God. And he is, in his own way, a mighty man of God today. So it's not like all the promises have not come true. But in spite of all of my fond hopes and prayers, my son, who was a beautiful child and grew into just a handsome young man, came unglued at the age of about 16 or so. And he was later diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. And I did not know, frankly, how to respond to that at the time. I just, it wasn't that I was embarrassed to tell others about it, but I just assumed that, well, God will certainly heal him completely, quickly. And if not today, then tomorrow. And if not tomorrow, then, well, next week, and then next month, and then next year. And I think I came to a realization, because I am a filmmaker by profession. I came to a realization that I needed to share the story with obviously a wider audience. And it was not a story that any parent would want to tell, right? I would much rather have told the story of my son's great exploits and successes, and how he, became mighty upon the earth. One of the biblical promises, that your children will be mighty upon the earth. But I've since come to learn that God is at work in all things, and he's especially at work in our brokenness. Not that I can fully explain how that works, but I just know he's there. I know that he comforts those who mourn. And I could say the story grew from a place of deep sorrow and mourning.
Yeah. And the type of sorrow and mourning that's difficult to describe to others if they haven't had something to compare it with in their lives. And you're talking to someone that has shared that deep mourning, Chris. We didn't know each other before this interview, but I am a parent that understands that deep mourning. Just for you to know some of my background, my husband and I, after having 4 biological, beautiful girls, we were wrecked by the fact that in Brazil, there were so many orphans, older orphans.
Mhm.
And so we adopted a 12-year-old little boy and an 8-year-old little boy, brothers.
Mhm.
And we had specifically asked for things not to be a part, of the adoption. You know how you do that? But
Mhm. Mhm.
once we were down in Brazil, we got the full story that not only were the boys born drug addicted, but they had a long history of mental illness, and so severe in the family that almost everybody in the family had mental illness.
Ah,
And
yes.
there we were at great cost.
Mm.
And they're telling us this after we met the boys.
Oh, oh dear.
So the
No.
reality is, it's like, of course, you're
Mm.
praying, God, you're going to bring these boys in and there's going to be a house of healing. And I do believe that that happened. But
Mm.
I also believe that literally I've been changed through the experience. And just to fast forward, in terms of understanding what you mean by unglued, but
Mm.
also my firstborn died of an apparent drug overdose when he
Mm.
was 23.
Mm.
And now my secondborn has
Mm.
been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and
Mm.
he's in assisted living,
Mm.
an apartment.
Mm. Sure.
And
Mm.
so there's a whole journey that most people don't understand, but I've just given you and the listeners, most of the listeners probably don't know this about my life.
Mhm.
But when you talk about deep sorrow and pain, I understand it, and yet I sense God's presence in it. And I know that God is so merciful and loving. And I know my son Dre, for example, I know he's in heaven.
Yeah.
I know he is in heaven with Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, that's yes. It's beautiful. I think of when Jesus, the leper, was crying out, and Jesus walked over to him and embraced him, hugged him, touched him. Um, the leper was healed. If that leper had not been there in great pain, first of all, he wouldn't have been crying out for the Lord. And if he had never cried out to the Lord, he never would have met the Lord.
Mhm.
Not only did he meet the Lord, but he was embraced,
Yeah.
hugged by the Lord. Um,
Mhm.
like, Jesus is not put off by our pain. He's not put off by our sickness. I think a lot of folks in the church are either scared of mental illness or embarrassed by
Mhm.
mental illness,
Mhm.
and they shouldn't be. They don't need to be. In fact, they shouldn't be. Let me just stop there. They should not be, because the world needs those of us who name the name of Christ to reach out to others who are hurting, suffering.
Yeah.
Whether they're a leper physically or a leper spiritually,
Mhm.
mentally.
Mhm.
We need to embrace them, hug them.
Mhm. Yeah, and also the parents of those, because the reality is, I know with my story, I've been very careful, who I talk about with it very carefully,
Yeah.
because there's lots of judgment that can be cast.
Yes.
Have you prayed enough? Have
Yeah.
you cast out the demons? Have you?
Yeah.
And the reality is, God does heal.
Yeah.
And there have been miracles of people with mental illness
Yeah.
healed.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but but there's also a healing journey that you've got to find your way through, of knowing that God is a miraculous God, but sometimes the final healing is in heaven.
Well, when you say that, I have to tell you the story behind how I ended the movie, because at the end of the movie, and earlier on in the movie, I plant the seed of the resurrection. It's not a very overtly Christian film. It's not intended to be.
Right.
But there are subtle messages in there, and at times scripture's even quoted, but it's done in a more oblique way, if you will. But that the concept, not the concept, the creed, the cornerstone of part of our faith is the resurrection, you know. And when my son was showing no signs of improvement, his name is Daniel. When Daniel it was some of the darkest days and weeks of my life, of his life. He was in a very, very bad way. And we were living in Mexico at the time, and he was in a hospital in Mexico. And I remember God comforting me one night by reminding me that the resurrection is not a wish, it's a surety.
That's right.
It's a promise. It's a promise, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I had this sort of epiphany, I'll say, that, and it was like taking a huge load off my back. It's not necessarily that I'll see my son healed here on earth. That had been my objective up until that point in time. I was sort of demanding a happy ending to the story here and now on earth. And God comforted me saying, hey, do not fear the one who can kill the body, but fear the one who after he has killed the body has the power to cast into hell. Yea, I say unto thee, fear thou him, that one. That's the one. And it's that God who has a wonderful final chapter for us, right? And that's the resurrection. And when I got a hold of that, the resurrection, I was free. I was set free. And I still walk in that power.
Yeah. I mean, it's very transformative. And in many ways, I have been transformed by adopting my sons. I mean, I have been changed.
You took that chance.
And the reality is I'm a better person. I mean, I really am. It's like God molded my character. I remember when we had the boys tested, you know, after we adopted them, you know, and, you know, the test scores in terms of mental aptitude were severely low, like 0.01 out of 100% in several areas. And I remember I got in the car and I started to realize they're not going to be able to get jobs. You know, or there's like different things that you start to realize just in terms of unless God does a miracle mental capacity. And what happened to me in that moment, I was in the car all alone and I felt the love of God. I mean, I felt and knew the love of God. And I knew that he loved my son so much that he had interrupted our lives. We had sold our house to pay for the adoption and at great sacrifice. But I understood the love of God like I've never understood it, the tangible, active presence. So I knew this would be a hard interview for me, Chris. And it, you know, it's just, if you're a Healing Rain watcher, what you're seeing is the intensity of the suffering and pain of those who love and care for those that are walking through mental illness. And the types of things that we have walked through that you're going to show in this film coming up, most people don't walk through the types of things that we've been through because of the mental illness and in particular schizophrenia. So can you help those? Most people don't understand schizophrenia. Can you talk about what you learned about schizophrenia?
Yes. Well, I'll try, I should say. the brain is kind of the last medical frontier. I've heard it said, it's not well understood even today. I think they've made many advances, but there's still so many mysteries. And even today, they mix what they call a cocktail, quote unquote, of medications to treat schizophrenics and other mental illnesses. They're kind of guessing,
Yeah.
So with that as a backdrop, what I've experienced with my son, and I have another who has a similar diagnosis, his younger brother, who also is in assisted living, but his case has not been as severe as that of his older brother. And he had some other disabilities which impinged on his, ability to operate at a higher level, let's just say, kind of like you mentioned your sons, but what I've learned is that schizophrenia, as its name implies, creates a division. It's like a break, in a person's mind, where they, first of all, those who know them and love them best cannot even recognize them sometimes. They're so altered. But this break, this crack, this fissure brings out another person. It's like somebody you haven't seen before or met. And I think that can be the root or the base upon which people will think, oh, well, they're demon possessed. They have an evil spirit, but I have never felt that my son was possessed. Oppressed, yes, but we're all oppressed by the devil. No, I believe that the root of it is biological. I mean, okay, maybe the root of it is spiritual, but not in terms of a demonic possession. Everything is spiritual in a sense. But there's a biological component to mental illness that needs to be recognized, that needs to be acknowledged. And it's schizophrenic. I'll just say quickly, people who are schizophrenic can manifest hearing voices. They can imagine things that aren't real, have hallucinations. But to me, these are just symptoms. These are symptoms of an illness. And what doctor would not treat, or what person who cares and loves would not show compassion to someone who's sick? So that's where we need to come from, in my view. Primarily have the approach of someone who cares about the suffering of others.
Yeah, in building that bridge of healing, building that bridge of God's love. I mean, God's love is the most powerful force, and people can feel if they're loved or if they're judged.
Yes.
And building that sense of love is huge. And creating that healing team. I've been so grateful. In fact, God, through our journey, has given us so many different people, social workers, or, a lawyer, or, I mean, if I would go through all the stories I've walked through, there's a plethora of people that have been incredibly helpful. And I just am so thankful for that. And I'm also thankful for this movie, because I do believe it's going to awaken the church, that compassion is needed. We don't have a simple solution. And then the other thing that I began to understand too with my sons, I wouldn't have understood it if it hadn't been my sons, but that sometimes they resist any type of drugs. They don't want drugs that are medication. You know what I mean? To be medicated.
Yes, medication, sure.
But they seek out other ways of medication through drugs on the street. Yes.
Yeah.
that just heightens the problem. And then just
Absolutely.
realizing how common it is for drug addiction and schizophrenia or other types of mental illness to be hand in hand, because of the chemical, not only because of the chemical imbalance, also the choices, but it's just not a simple thing to walk through. It's complex.
That is correct. Very much so. No, very much so. But love keeps the ship afloat.
Yeah. Yeah, love, I think, it's the key, and also pointing them to God. And
Yeah.
one thing that comforted me after the death of my first son, I mean, I can't even describe how I was plunged into grief. I mean, it was the deepest grief I had ever experienced. And I'm a public person, but I knew I did not have enough emotional energy to make it a public story. I just didn't. So my healing team was small, the people that I talked to. But the day after it had happened, my other son had a vision. And it was a vision where he said, "Mom, I was transported. It was like I was lifted up and I could see, and I was lifted into heaven. And it was so bright, like the grass was so green and the sun was so bright, and there was so much lightness." And then I heard Dre's voice, and I turned around and I saw his smile. And he said, "Bro, I'm in heaven. I'm fine." And so Zeke shared that story. And I mean, we just cried together for a long time.
Yeah.
And I remember the next Sunday morning, we're pastors, but on that Sunday, we were at another church, and they had a dance team. It was two Black men, that made me think of my sons, big and strong. And they began to sing about heaven. And I got this picture in my mind of my son, Dre, with this huge smile, lighting up heaven, and him meeting my father who's in heaven, my earthly father. And there's something about the comfort of heaven when you have someone that you've lost, that it's a deep and very real comfort that shows the goodness of God.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at our time, and we're already coming to the close of this. And I want to encourage those listeners to go to this movie, to support this movie. I believe it's a timely movie. And I think I'll probably see you at the National Religious Broadcasters. Are you going to be there?
Yes.
Yes. Well, as we close, any final things that you would like the Healing Rain listeners to know?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. I guess the main thing would be, please ask them to pray for just a huge audience to see the film, because the way technology is nowadays, we're planning to release the film globally, not just start in, say, a city in the United States and move to another city kind of thing, but globally. So it'll be like a virtual cinema premiere. And there's the possibility of partnering with other organizations around the world where the movie could be seen in countries of Africa, Europe, and Asia, Latin America. And my heart is to reach people, with the love of God, and to share that love. And if my story and my family's story of suffering and grief and insanity can be a blessing for others, and to help carry their load, and point them to the Savior. I was telling a friend earlier today that missionaries need they need tools. And imagine a missionary talking about this film and inviting a friend to watch it with him. And the friend is parched. They're so thirsty, their tongue is stuck to the roof of their mouth. And this movie would be like a cup of cold water. Now, the missionary will have to lead them through the sinner's prayer. The movie's not doing that per se, but the movie is satisfying that thirst. And sometimes, the first thing you have to do is satisfy somebody at just a broader level and then move on to more specific things. So my prayer request is that God would just open up all the doors necessary to have a huge international audience for the movie.
Well, Chris, let's stay in touch because you probably don't know this about me, but I travel internationally regularly. So I'm headed to Kenya soon. I'll be in Estonia. I'll be in Brazil. So
we just found out today that through the help of some donors, we have our Brazilian Portuguese dub covered. So the movie's going to be in Brazilian Portuguese.
Oh, very good. So, I will be down. We need to talk outside of this interview, but I may be able to help in some of the different countries I'll be in. I know I'll be in Brazil after, it's come out. So let's talk. But listeners, I just want to thank you for, your journey. You are listeners that you care about the healing, the wholeness, about body, mind, soul, spirit, but you also care about relational healing and, the pain and suffering that we've gone through. And, I've written a book that's coming out soon, Healing Rain. And part of what I try and do in that book is I talk about miraculous healing that I've seen and been a part of and laid hands on and seen deaf ears come open and blind eyes open. That's my life. And yet there's also times where there's a mystery that what we prayed for does not necessarily come to pass this side of heaven. Yeah. And I believe today that you're going to be encouraged to live out the message of Christ, love and power through any circumstance that you find yourself in.